The beginning of the Spanish gangster disciples on the streets is a tough one to nail down, as it appears to be a culmination of ideas at 87th and Houston in South Chicago that brought about this formation. In the year 1979, the South Chicago gang landscape was changing as old-school gangs that once ran this neighborhood began to retire as new groups emerged. The Royal Knights were one of the old groups that go back to 1960, and the Saints of 87th were another group that began to retire. The Saints ran 87th and Houston, while Royal Knights ran 88th to 89th and Commercial area. These groups were neighbors to each other. By this time, Saints and Royal Knights were allies and may have always been allies. Members of the Royal Knights from the neighborhood had been incarcerated for a number of years in the 1970s and had flipped to maniac Latin disciples while incarcerated. These former Knights included Rudy Rios, Rico Mickey Villa, Jesse Montanez, and his brother. By 1979, some of these guys began to be released from prison and returned to these streets, but did not represent Royal Knights or bring it back. During their time in prison, they were allied with the New Folks Alliance that was developing between 1978 to 1979. Duck of the Maniac Latin Disciples was one former Royal Knight that came out to unite what was left of Royal Knights and Saints, but this had no official title or anything like that. These were older guys banding together at 87th and Houston to watch out for the community. In the year 1980, Shaky of the Milwaukee Kings, alongside a board of folks that included Victor King Vic Gomez of the Maniac Latin Disciples, helped create the Spanish Growth and Development, or SGD, concepts. Shaky was bestowed the title of the head of the SGD, and he made all the decisions. Before being released from prison in 1981, Rudy Rios asked permission from Shaky to bring SGD to the streets and start a mob in South Chicago. Shaky gave permission for this to happen, and Rudy Rios came out of prison then preaching about SGD and folks at 87th and Houston. The Royal Knights had just declared extinction in the year 1980, but the heart of them was still in the neighborhood, as was former members and teens that were the last members. The name of Spanish Growth and Development, or Spanish Gangster Disciple, was not required to be used by this new group, and because the Saints previously ran 87th and Houston for decades, and because the last remnant of their members were involved, they wanted their name as part of this. The new group was initially called Saint Disciples. Just to make it clear, this had nothing to do with the Saints of 45th and Wood. In the back of the yards, those Saints knew these Saint Disciples and were allies, but were not the same club. Two brothers from the back of the yard Saints moved to South Chicago to partake, but there was no merger, and the SGDN was not born out of the Saints of 45th Street or anything like that. To further clarify, the Saints of 87th and Houston did not give birth to street SGDs either. This was just remaining members of the Saints of 87th that wanted to put this together, and for a year at most their name was used. By 1982, the name became disagreeable for some reason and needed to be changed to pay better homage to SGD. The name was changed to the Saint Spanish Gangster Disciples. This name would only last about a year, and during this early era the SGDs were not very well known. Finally, in the year 1983, the club was renamed Spanish Gangster Disciples, and that was the name that stuck. This is also when recruitment accelerated. At the same time, neighborhood gangs like Latin Kings, Latin Counts, and Latin Dragons started to get big. SGDs were with the folks, while those other groups were People Alliance. Most gangs on the southeast side of Chicago were People allies. The list of People Alliance gangs roaming the east side, Hegewisch, South Chicago, and South Deering was long: Latin Kings, Latin Counts, Spanish Vice Lords, Latin Dragons, Black P-Stones, Conservative Vice Lords, Four Corner Hustlers, Renegade Vice Lords, Mafia Insane Vice Lords, and Traveling Vice Lords. Most of these mobs were in South Chicago alone. The only folks on the southeast side were SGDs, Gangster Disciples, and King Cobras. King Cobras were from South Deering only in the 80s. Gangster Disciples were an African American group and usually went their own way. Therefore, the SGDs were out there on their own in South Chicago, which meant they had to gangbang hardcore in order to survive. This meant many shootings, beatings, and incarcerations for many members. Many homes would have bullet holes in them, and the 87th and Houston area was jumping with gang activity right away starting in the mid-1980s. SGDs had to be down and had to be prepared to fight or shoot. There was no way to be a member without getting involved with it. In the summer of 1983, the Spanish Gangster's disciples formed on the north side on the corner of Rosemont and Broadway, original north side, in the Edgewater neighborhood. Shaky received a blessing from Larry Hoover of the Gangster Disciples to put a SGD group in Edgewater, and Shaky passed that blessing down for SGDs to open this north side chapter in 1983. The SGDs of Broadway often hung out with the SGDs of 87th. They were friends, and perhaps this is why the Saint part of the name was dropped, so there was solidarity. From Rosemont and Broadway, Top Cat moved to the Albany Park neighborhood and opened a new section at St. Louis and Ainsley. A short time later, the SGDs would open the Broadway and Coiler Uptown Green section in the Uptown neighborhood, then Sunnyside and Kimball opened in the Albany Park neighborhood. The SGDs also made their way to the Rogers Park neighborhood at Columbia and Glenwood in 1983. In all these neighborhoods, the SGDs found intense rivalry with the Latin Kings, making them one of their first enemies up north. The SGDs were given great backing and resources upon full formation in 1983, hence why they expanded into multiple neighborhoods so quickly and heavily. Because the South Chicago SGDs were ruthless as they were used to this way of operating, which was immediately adopted by the Northside SGDs, and they also became a major force to be reckoned with. Old schoolers from other gangs that I have talked to admit they had a hard time going against SGDs. In the Albany Park neighborhood, the SGDs would grow very powerful very quickly in the 1980s. They would eventually evolve into a long-lasting organization in this neighborhood and domination in this area even in recent years. In the year 1986, Rico Villa and his wife opened a bakery in the suburb of Elgin. This is how the SGDs got started in Elgin, as sometime later the SGDs began to grow into the suburb, and it started with this bakery. Eventually, in the 1980s, the SGDs opened Olive and Clark in the Edgewater neighborhood, which was dominated by the PR Stone Street Gang. And once they found out about SGDs, a nasty war broke out, which inevitably ended up being too costly of a gang war, especially since the Stones were there first. The SGDs were more about making money and money being made, and Clark and Olive was not suitable, so they moved operations to Early and Wayne, which was close to Senn High School. At this new street corner, they were selling major amounts of drugs, especially marijuana, out of two apartment buildings that faced each other. Some of the customers were other Folk Nation gangs either from the area or outside the area. And funny enough, there were even customers that happened to be Latin Kings who would buy large supplies from the SGDs to distribute on their own. The SGDs opened at Lakewood and Granville in the Edgewater neighborhood and congregated near Haight Elementary School. In the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, the SGDs opened territory at Lawrence and Winthrop. The SGDs also traveled further north and opened territory in the Rogers Park neighborhood at Glenwood and Columbia and Lawrence and Harding, which they called Lawrence City. The SGDs also made new territory over in Albany Park at the corners of Drake and Ainsley and Sunnyside and Kimball. On the south side, the SGDs opened turf at 89th and Baltimore in South Chicago, along with 26th and Tripp in Little Village and 47th and Walcott in the back of the Yards neighborhood. The early 1990s was a crazy time for the SGDs that involved both growth and declination. First, there was the murder of the organization's founder Rudy Rios, which left Rudy Guzman in charge. Then right after that he was killed. The power then went to Lil D to run street operations while Antonio D. Quintero ran things in the joint. This was for the South Side chapter. As for the North Side, the original 7 had all ended up serving prison terms, and power was assumed by a member of the Latin Eagles that flipped to become a SGD named Demon. Demon saw that the SGDs were weakened by these incarcerations and took this opportunity to come to this temporarily weakened gang and become the leader. In one of his first orders of business, Demon declared war on the Latin Eagles, his former gang, probably because of old animosity. Demon was a greedy leader that taxed his fellow gang members heavily on drug sales, and many SGDs resented this, especially the older members. Demon knew about this animosity, so he decided to increase his power in order to show those that disagreed with his power. Therefore, Demon colonized the suburbs of Elgin aka Evil E, Prospect Heights aka Piper Lane, Highwood, Wheeling, South Holland, Whiting, Indiana, and East Chicago, Indiana. In the suburbs he found young and impressionable kids that were eager to gangbang and would have no issue paying the high taxes because they did not know any better. He could also get them to kill for him if the older members objected too much. Demon was said to be greedy and kept a lot of money for himself, even money that was supposed to be used for gang operations. In September of 1991, the Chicago police started watching the SGDs at 88th and Houston because they had become so violent that residents were in fear. The SGDs were in nasty gang wars with Latin Kings, Latin Counts, and Latin Dragons in the vicinity, and this caused the neighborhood to be all shot up, with even non-gang banging residents having bullet holes in their walls and windows. After the summer of 1992, things really heated up badly as bullets were flying and bodies were dropping. Operation Houston was now in full effect, and on March 30th, 1993, 7 members of SGD were arrested, including Antonio D. Quintero, who was just released not too long before, while Lil D got locked up. These key arrests severely crippled all South Side operations, especially since D appointed Demon to run everything now. In the joint before this big arrest, Quintero was trying really hard to unify the Latin folks and expand Spanish growth and development concepts. However, Demon ended up working counterproductively and waged war on fellow folk allies such as Imperial Gangsters and Maniac Latin Disciples. Both D and Lil D were released from jail or prison not too long after and were discussing what to do about Demon, as he was trouble and seemingly ruining the organization. Demon got wind of this and recruited his suburban soldiers to kill Lil D, but the assassination failed. But a short time later, another assassination attempt was successful. However, the murder was blamed on rival gangs. As time went on, SGD lost a lot of territory due to police presence, gentrification, and lack of effective leadership. 88th and Houston fell apart and Ambrose grew a set on that corner, but this was granted to Ambrose from SGD in 1995. Ambrose did not muscle in and take it. Broadway and Coiler ended up becoming the SGD major section. SGDs would have revivals in later decades in South Chicago, and 87th and Houston area still remains SGD territory, but members are often not as reckless to avoid incarceration.